Okay guys, more on making dance music for complete beginners. I want to talk a little bit more about trance. It's an interesting genre. In the previous video I just talked a bit about it and I showed some basic stuff about the kind of fundamental roots of old school trance. Now here's the thing. If you go to one of these online music stores where they sell dance music and you choose the genre trance today, then you get tracks like this. Etc. Big, massive, upfront, usually major key, major scales, big anthemic hooks over usually major scale chord progressions, right? Very upfront, huge, multi-oscillator, sawtooth and pluck type sounds. Very, very, very commercial sounding. That's what they call trance now. Some people call it euphoric trance or uplifting trance or whatever, you know. It's very, very, very hooky and commercial. Big, massive synthesizer hook sound, right? If you go and you want to listen to and buy more traditional trance, now this is usually categorized as psychedelic trance or psy trance. And it sounds like this if you go to a shop and want to buy stuff today. Etc. Right? And you can hear the difference straight away. The psychedelic trance, as they're calling it, it doesn't have those big, massive, major key, major scale, anthemic hooks. It's much more subtle, and all the little licks and riffs and most of the arpeggiations and things are in a minor key, using minor intervals, little semitones up, up and down like that, and you know, often the scale, the intervals being used for those quite minimal licks is coming from the Indian subcontinent, almost like Bollywood note intervals, right? Okay, so like, how do we get to this? Right, the traditional trance, now called psychedelic trance, and then this big commercial stuff. Yeah, you know what I mean? Okay, well, let's just talk about that a bit. Now, everything I'm going to say now is my perception of it. I'm no expert, right? And plenty of people out there might think I'm talking rubbish, but this is my perception of it. I mean, I was clubbing all through the 80s, all through the 90s. Different genres, you know, I'm not particularly fixed on one genre, but I do, or I did enjoy trance a lot, still like it. Trance started to appear back in the late 80s, early 90s, coming out of the first wave of the rave scene, right? And it wasn't as fast as it is now. The thing about trance now, both the psychedelic type and the commercial type, right? The commercial stuff, the uplifting, euphoric trance with the big massive hooks, major scale stuff, it's all at 138 beats per minute. Sometimes it goes up to like 140, very occasionally a little bit higher, but it's nearly all at 138 beats per minute. But that is a lot faster than house, right? The more psychedelic stuff, this is sometimes at 138, but usually slightly faster at 140. But it can go up to 141, 2, 3. So they're both in the same ballpark BPM, around 140, which is the first thing about trance. It's a lot faster than most other forms of club music, right? So when it first started evolving, you got the kind of forms of old school psychedelic trance appearing over beats, but at a much slower tempo. So like here's some stuff from the very late 80s, very early 90s, when trance was starting to become a thing. And again, hear that, you know, the sub-Indian consonants, intervals between the notes, very minor key, you know, very Indian sounding, Asian sounding, whatever. Lots of squelchy, filtery stuff going on, lots of touches from the old acid scene, you know. There's that Indian sounding melody again, very minor, with the 303 behind it burbling away, you know.
Too many people would have to die, and all we do is ask why.
That quite gated, yeah, right. So you got all that kind of those Indian, Asian sounding minor key melody licks in there. It's got quite a it's got that kind of vibe going on, and the acidy touches, but it's a lot slower, right? Okay, now that's the end of the 80s, very early 90s, but by the time we get to the mid 90s, 94, 93, 95, let's say 93 to 95, it's sped up a lot. It's come up to about 140 beats per minute. It's got faster. It's working its way up to the faster tempo that we have it today, right? Of around 140. So when it was early days, late 80s, early 90s, coming out of that first wave of the rave scene, the rave music wasn't that fast. It wasn't right like 140 beats a minute. So it started off at a slower tempo, similar to rave, and then speeded up. Now, my perception of that is two things. Well, one to do with the drug. I think my perception of it was what happened was that the early trance stuff started to form its own scene where people loved those touches in those sort of half trance, half rave tracks and wanted more of it. So, pardon me. So they started developing their own scene. And the tempo got faster and faster. And this music was really for people into acid and mushrooms rather than MDMA. It wasn't really a party drug music. And that's why you never get even... So this is the early stuff, right? It's quite minor key, and there's nothing big and bold. There's no big massive hooks in it. Same as with the newer stuff. Okay, because with the drug on that scene, on the trance scene, acid and mushrooms, they're psychedelic drugs. And psychedelic drugs, they haven't got anything in them that drives the body. There's no sort of amphetamine-like quality to those drugs that pushes your body. It's all about opening up the mind. And so the music's spatial and open. And in that space, on those drugs, very subtle, small things take on great significance. So the music's open with lots of little interesting things happening in it. And it's always very minor key and subdued. You know, and washes of sound swell up and then disappear and then wash back again a little bit later. And there's lots of time for things to gradually evolve over time with the filter and things like that, right? It's music your mind can go into and explore, and that drives your body to dance, right? That's my perception of how it kind of started to develop. Also, I think it's true to say quite a lot of the people that got into making trance in the early days, because a lot of people got into the rave scene who were not into dance music, right? Club music before that was pretty much exclusively for people into black music, right? But one thing that happened with the rave scene was a lot of rockers got into dance, right? Through the drug, obviously, through the drugs. I mean, I've been at house parties where there's been 40 Hells Angels, right? And I mean like real bikers and Hells Angels, raving their you-know-whats off to rave music and having the absolute time of their lives. Even though traditionally they'd be listening to, you know, Sabbath and things like that, heavy metal and rock. Okay, so, and I think a lot of the people who got into making the early trance stuff were coming from a rock background. They'd been rock musicians. And perhaps that drove the tempo up a little bit as well. But primarily, it's the rise in the tempo for me was about the drugs. It works at that tempo with the drug. It's a tribal tempo, right, for tribal dancing. And you got to remember, a lot of this stuff in the early days was about the traveller scene, you know, and all that. All right? Okay. But then, where did this commercial stuff come from? Okay, well, the best way to find that out is just go to YouTube and you search Trance Anthems 1995 and just listen to the stuff. And then search Trance Anthems 1996 and 97 and 98 and 99, 2000, 2001, 2003. And you'll hear, as we get to the mid-90s, these new, more commercial, bigger upfront licks start coming in. But the one thing that it has in common with the old trance is that fast 140 tempo, around 140. Now, yes, the new commercial sound that was coming in with these big upfront major key licks and chord progressions, a lot of which are based in classical music. Yeah, there'd often be things in the music tipping the hat to the old trance, little 303 lines working away or little arpeggios doing their thing, right? And the beat was very similar, but it was all about bringing in this big uplifting major key hook thing, right? And that to me was more about the party scene, you know, coming in like what I'd call the second wave of rave in the mid-90s, right, when dance music started to get very commercially popular. And a lot of those dance tracks from the mid to late 90s and early 2000s actually became chart hits, some of them, right? It became more and more commercial, and it wasn't for people taking mushrooms and acid into the trip thing. It was more for people into MDMA and a few vodkas and some coke. Do you know what I mean? It was party music. The faster tempo, right? But really more in your face, like here's the big hook, here's the big build, you know. because that goes with that party drug thing, right? In that, you don't want these subtle things, right? So this, if you listen, just go through and listen to some of these compilations, and you'll start hearing around the mid-90s, working through to the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s, more of these tracks are appearing with this big, massive super saw sound. And that's, a super saw sound is a multi-oscillator synth doing like 6 sawtooth oscillators tuned at different octaves with slight detuning to make it even fatter. And you roll the filter back to this really vibrant plucking sound, like tuk, 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 and then roll the filter open, it becomes a huge fizzing sound. And that sound started to get a lot more popular and was on more and more tracks, etc. And when it first came out, this new trance, the trance purists were like, well, what are they calling this trance for? This is nothing like trance. But it was being called trance, and the name kind of stuck. And because there was a lot of money in that scene, whereas the underground scene was more about, you know, parties being held in squats and parties being held in old factory buildings or old churches or anything like that, or outside in a field round a bonfire or whatever. Whereas this was more about big commercial super clubs and things like that, right? So that's, to me, where this sort of big, modern, big upfront, massive anthemic hooks, big positive major scale, major intervals, melodies, that's where it came from. It evolved over started coming in the mid to late 90s, evolved. It was getting really strong at the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s, you know, and it just established itself, right? The more old school style trance, that never went away. All that happened with that is it just evolved and evolved in terms of production. It's still today pretty much exactly as it was in the mid-90s in terms of the traditional licks and all that. But nowadays, with, you know, Logic, Cubase and all the rest of it, unlimited tracks, unlimited software instruments, unlimited effects, it's become a much, much more glossy, deeper sound. But it still keeps true to its roots, right? So the early original trance doesn't sound that much different from the modern trance. Psychedelic trance we're talking about now, the traditional sound, right? But the difference is the early stuff was all done on hardware, so it had a very more basic sound. Because, you know, in the early and mid-90s, there was no Logic, Cubase, Pro Tools and all that. You know, it's hard for youngsters to remember, but honestly, we didn't get Logic and Cubase and all that really syncing audio and MIDI reliably and properly, and software instruments started to really become a reliable, good thing that you could play in real time. That didn't really happen until the end of the 90s. It really didn't, you know. So the early stuff was all done on hardware, and you just had a mixing desk, and you had a few synths, maybe a basic sampler and a drum box, and, you know, one reverb unit, maybe one or maybe 2 delay units, maybe a filter you could sweep stuff with. You know, it was quite basic, the sound, raw. Whereas the modern stuff, the only difference is it's just much, much bigger production. But it hasn't really changed. It's still subtle, it's still evolving, there's still no big upfront stuff, and it's still nearly all done in a minor key with minor intervals in any licks and melodies, right? There's a big commercial stuff. Again, big, massive production has got more and more and more big with you know, Logic, Cubase and all those sequences getting more and more developed and more powerful computers. But it's just got that commercial edge. Major key stuff, right? Big, massive anthem hooks. And that to me is the story of it. So if you want to see that and investigate it, as I said, go to YouTube and just search for trance anthems by year, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, and then into the early 2000s, you know, up to 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you'll hear how this stuff evolved. Now, some of the time you'll get the traditional stuff, but you'll start, as we get into the late 90s and into the early 2000s, more and more of this big super saw commercial stuff you'll hear, right? Okay, that's the whole thing of it, really. Okay, so now there is one other type of trance, which is the 3-time thing I mentioned in the previous video. Now, here's some examples of it in, this is 3-time, you know, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like that. That's the rhythm. Classified by an online music shop as just straight trance. Yeah. And I said the first time I ever heard a 3-time trance track was in the very early 90s, and I perceived that the guy doing it was Celtic influences that were influencing. But the more you listen to it, there's some sort of, I don't know if there's some sort of Persian thing going on there with that bounce, with that 1 2 3 1 2 3, you know. So all these are classed as trance. And the feature of this 3-time is usually that the synth work is down in the lower registers. It's not really high up synth stuff going on. It's deeper. You know, down in the lower octaves. You know, right? Now those 3-time tracks are from a music portal, and they're advertised under the regular trance genre with all this kind of stuff. Right? These are also in 3-time, but they're classified as psychedelic trance, but there's not a lot of difference. Yeah, so, you know, I don't really hear much difference between those, which were classed as psychedelic trance by an online shop in 3-time, and these classed as regular trance, the more commercial, you know. But there is that 3-time thing. Right? Now, another thing you might have heard in some of these bigger commercial sounding tunes is that after the kick drum, the music does a surge up, and that's become very much a part of trance. So the synth riff is going after the kick, like that, and that there, can you hear that surge up of the synth after the kick? And it's not in all of them, but it is a feature. There, it's on that one as well. It's a feature of this modern trance to have that surging up, and that's a consequence of the kick drum, because the kick drum in this commercial, uplifting, euphoric, really sort of major key trance, sort of club trance I'd call it, is that it's got a much heavier kick drum than traditional psychedelic trance, which tends to have a more rounded upper mid-range, sort of lower mid-range rather than deep bass kick, right? That's because I think a lot of the time the kick will often do fills, like these little rolls and fills. And if the kick is too deep and too low, then it's going to get all messy. And the other thing is, it just isn't like super bottom end in traditional psychedelic trance, right? But this modern super trance, you know, this club trance, let's call it, that's what I'll call it, has got a much heavier, meatier club type kick drum, right? You know, with lots of pitch envelope, right? And so it's compressing, and then when the kick drum's gone, the music surges back up after. It's just pumping. But that started to become a feature that people will program in deliberately using the envelope on the synth to make it surge up. It's almost like chaps in ska, you know, check like that, or reggae, you know, check like that. But so I think that sort of surging up thing, it came from a very heavy compressor with a very loud kick doing the pumping, but it started to become something that people program in, and you can even get synth presets that have got, you know, trance synth presets that have got that surge built into the sound. So quite a lot of the tracks you hear this like that, right? Okay, that's another thing about this new style trance. You very rarely, if ever, get that in the psychedelic stuff. I can't recall hearing it really much. Okay. Now the other thing is, just to finish, if you're thinking of getting into making the psychedelic stuff, you probably will be okay with the stock synths that come in your door, whether it's Cubase, Logic, Sonar, whatever, synthesizers are included in the package, software synths, instruments. And because this psychedelic trance from its early days to today is more subtle, it doesn't have these massive upfront melodies, and because it's constantly got its foot in the old days of more primitive synthesizers, right, you can get away with doing a lot of the parts with just a basic sawtooth mono synth if the filter's good. Yeah, you don't need like a lot of massive synth work. So it's more about the overall composition and the little bits going on, right? Whereas with the more modern, what I call club trance, and again, this goes back to the thing I was saying in one of the earlier videos in this series about William Orbit talking about recognisable icons in music, right? This club style of trance, you can hear that super saw, as they call it, multi-oscillator sawtooth, massive synth sound. Yeah, that is a recognisable icon of this genre, and you've got to have those sounds. And they're harder to get from the stock synths in your door. So if you want to get into making this kind of music, you probably would be better investing in one third-party software synth that will give you those sounds out of the box, so you can then focus on the composition, right? If you're not really into making synthesizer sounds, programming synths, because you know, it's just easier, right? You want those sounds, and there they are out of the box. Now, the best thing to choose a synth is go online and search for, you know, best synth for trance, and you'll hear a lot of opinions. Some people will be talking about hardware synths, but a lot of people will be talking about software. And you'll find the same synthesizers, software synths, the same names being brought up again and again. Sylenth from Lenar Digital. Sylenth is a hugely popular synth, well, not just for trance, but it is very popular for trance. Sylenth was one of the first software synths that came with this enormous, big, massive sawtooth, multi-oscillator sawtooth sound, and the pluck sound that the filter opens out into the big fizzy sawtooth, you know. That sound, that big fizzy. Yeah. Sylenth was one of the first synths to really go to town on that in software form. But it does a lot of other stuff besides. And then there's another synth that you'll see mentioned a lot called Zebra. There's one called Nexus. You know, just investigate it and have a listen to the demos things. And the other thing about those software synths is that there are thousands of presets that you can buy quite cheaply online from people who spend all their time writing, programming sounds, right? So there's a colossal collection of trance-ready sounds that you will hear in all the commercial tracks that you just load up and you can begin to work with them. And that would be my advice on that. Whereas I say, just to repeat, if you're going for the more psychedelic trance thing, which is much more subtle, you can probably do that with the stock synths that you've got already, because it's rooted in the old school, this music. Glossier production values, but it's rooted in the old school. So it doesn't require such a humongous, complex synthesizer sounds, right? Okay, it's more about sounds and spatial stuff, right? Okay. Okay, so look, there's a few more things about trance. It's an interesting genre, and it's an interesting genre if you really like, you know, the psychedelic stuff is really good if you really enjoy working almost with soundscapes, but at a dance tempo, a nice fast driving dance tempo. Also, this trance appeals, I think, a lot to rock musicians because of the faster tempo, you know, and it's less of a groove thing, right? You know, yeah. So, you know, if you want to get into the more old school rooted psychedelic stuff, interesting stuff, it's very soundscapey. Whereas this more modern commercial club trance is an interesting genre to get into if you're quite knowledgeable about modes and scales and classical progressions, because you can use those monstrous, you know, feel-good classic progressions in the music and make these enormous hooks. You know what I mean? Okay, now finally, just to finish, and we'll go to the browser for this. You might have heard like some other subgenres, hard trance. Now again, you can investigate yourself. Classic hard trance anthems. Now hard trance, well, look, this is from 1999 to 2001. Well, it just does what it says on the tin. It's trance, but it's just got a harder beat, bigger beat, you know. And often it can be a little bit faster than 140. You know? And in a way, you can say that this hard trance, as it kind of branched out, because you had the psychedelic trance, and then people started making it, but with a much more banging beat. And that contributed to this commercial trance, because it had that more banging club beat. So that probably influenced the commercial trance that appeared and became this sort of club euphoric uplifting trance, you know. I wouldn't say any of those to me were. Come on. No, I'm not hearing anything particularly what I would say is classic hard trance there. Let's try this one. But this is like... Come on. Yeah, I mean, that's hard trance. It's boom, 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 right? Oh. So many breakdowns. Yeah, right, that's really banging, right? That's hard. So many bloody breakdowns in music today. Yeah, that's hard trance, you know, really banging, but it's got the psychedelic edge, you know, and it might have some touches of the newer, more euphoric, sort of more major key sound in it, but generally it's still rooted in the old psychedelic stuff. Yeah, that's hard trance. And then you might have heard of Goa Trance. Now Goa Trance, well, it's just, you know, it's just like all the melodies in it are minor, and they're always the same notes, and then upper semitone. It's like all the melodies are from those minor interval melodies from the Indian subcontinent, basically, and it's got a sort of slightly springy, spongy bounce to it. In some of the synth work, doing the kind of chord stuff, it's got a kind of bit of a springiness to it, right? Let's try this one. And the other thing is the album cover will always be covered in all sorts of Eastern Indian subcontinent imagery. Yeah, it's always minor. You know what I mean? It's And that's sort of slightly, that sort of filtered organ-y sound you hear a lot, a sort of bouncy, springy, filtery organ sound, which sounds very similar to the sort of little Indian squeeze box organ that people like Nasrat Fateh Ali Khan, he's dead now, isn't he? I saw him once live. Qawwali Sufis, you know, they got that little, they sit on the floor and play, they got that little squeeze box and they pump it and just play the little keyboard, and it's sort of got that bouncy little organ sound but with a filter. Barking 303s, very didgeridoo sounding. You often get digiloops in this stuff. Yeah, so it's, you know, it's got these Indian melodies riddled all over it, lots of acidy sort of feel.
Searching for UFOs.
Yeah, always searching for UFOs. Aliens from another world have invaded our planet before, have been here before, all this kind of thing. It's what can you say about it compared to psychedelic trance? Well, it's I suppose a little bit more trippy, if you could find so. But the main thing is it's these minor key melodies, always minor key, always the same as psychedelic trance. You rarely hear anything with major intervals, major scales going on, right? And it's a little bit more forward in the synth work than psychedelic trance, which well, for me anyway, is a little bit more spatial, a little bit more open, with sounds firing off, right? If you listen to that, that's classic psychedelic trance, sort of straight trance nowadays. That chugging bottom end. You'll notice that the bass and the kick drum, you know, they're pretty much the same level. It's not a super heavy kick. It's a tappy kick, right? So they don't clash, because the bass is providing the rhythm as much as the kick at the bottom end, right? So you don't want the kick too loud. You don't want too deep. But that, you know, so there's your classic kind of... lots of burbly sounds and little noises and knocking sounds and shings and all that. Whereas your Goa stuff, and this is old, but... tell you what, let's search for Goa Trance 2017. Goa Trance, that's Psytrance as well. Psytrance, Goa mixed. Let's try this. I don't know what it's going to be like. There's not a huge... It's a 3-time one. There's not a huge difference between them. And then again, you've got sort of people going, well, they're calling it Goa, and other people go, well, it doesn't sound very Goa trance to me. I don't know. I mean, they're all much of a muchness, aren't they, at the end of the day when you listen to it? I mean, let's have a listen to this. They're very similar, Goa Trance, Psychedelic Trance, but I just personally, for me, Goa is a bit more busy in the synth work and less spatial than Psychedelic Trance. Psychedelic Trance is more about gaps between things and sounds and things happening here and there. Goa's got more of a driving synth work to it, but again, it's never major key, or hardly ever major key, and it's never sort of big and dominant like this commercial stuff. No way. Okay, so there you go. Look, you just do some searching online, have a listen, investigate it a bit. There's some thoughts on it, and I hope that's useful, and I'll see you for the next one.